He stole 2 beef legs every single day, and he got away with it for 8 straight years. So how did he actually pull it off before every delivery? The boss had Frank handle the sealing of the truck. Frank would go through the motions of checking everything, but really he was slipping the seals right into his sleeve. Along the way, he'd quietly sell off 2 legs of beef, then pull out the hidden seal from his cuff and reseal the truck compartment. Once the shipment reached the warehouse, he'd slip the loaders a little something, and the warehouse manager got a cut too. Then they'd just replace the missing meat from the stock already in the warehouse. And just like that, Frank kept that scheme running for 8 full years. But when his 3rd daughter was born, 2 beef legs just weren't cutting it anymore. On his last run, he drove an empty truck straight to the delivery point. That time, it all finally fell apart. Frank tried to pin it on the loaders, but that excuse didn't hold up for a second. In the end, his boss took him to court. With his back against the wall, Frank turned to the union lawyer for help. And to everyone's shock, with that lawyer's help, a case that should have been a guaranteed loss actually ended in a win. That night, the lawyer took Frank to a bar to celebrate. And right there, Frank met the man who would change the rest of his life. Russell. On the surface, Russell was just some guy running a curtain business. But in reality, he had powerful connections everywhere. If someone didn't know how much to pay to grease the right wheels, they went to Russell. If someone wanted to bribe an official, they went to Russell too. Even shady deals that couldn't see the light of day had to get his approval. In a lot of people's eyes, Russell was the one running things in the underworld. And Frank was no ordinary guy either. He'd served in the war, and he spoke Italian during combat. He'd personally taken care of people who betrayed him. Cold, ruthless, and loyal. Those traits made Russell take notice. Pretty soon, Frank started working for Russell. He got things done, and he didn't flip on people easily. So he quickly earned Russell's trust. When Frank's youngest daughter was born, Russell stood as her godfather at the baptism. That day, all kinds of social bigwigs showed up. For the first time, Frank felt like he had truly stepped into a different world. As his family grew bigger, Frank needed more and more money, so he started taking on private jobs. Someone offered him 10 grand to blow up a laundromat. Frank saw it as a solid payday. During the day, he scoped out the place. At night, he prepped the explosives and gasoline. But just as he was about to make his move, Russell's men stopped him in time. Because that laundromat belonged to someone important. If Frank had gone through with it, he would have been a dead man. To make up for his mistake, Frank tracked down the guy who hired him and handled the problem. From then on, Frank truly stepped into the underworld. He took care of one job after another and gradually became one of Russell's most trusted guys. But he wasn't in it for the money or status. He truly believed Russell had saved him once, and he owed him for that. Not long after, Russell introduced Frank to another man who would shape his life. Jimmy Hoffa, the president of the Teamsters Union. His influence rivaled even the president's. He controlled billions of dollars in union pension funds. Anyone who couldn't get money through normal channels would go to Jimmy. Even underworld figures like Russell. With Russell pulling the strings, Frank became the go-between for both sides. He stuck by Jimmy every day, helping him handle all kinds of problems. With his skills and loyalty, the two men grew close, and their families grew close too. A few years later, Kennedy was elected president, and Russell and his people had played a big part in making that happen. Once in office, Kennedy appointed his brother Robert as Attorney General, and Robert immediately started going after Jimmy. Why? Because Jimmy had backed Nixon in the election. During that time, Jimmy was under constant scrutiny from the FBI and the IRS. They were looking for anything that could put him behind bars. To help Jimmy out, Frank went to Russell, hoping he could pull some strings, but Russell said no. To grow his influence, Jimmy started taking Frank on speaking tours across the country, promoting loyal allies to key positions. Back then, the two of them got closer than ever. Jimmy even treated Frank like family, personally sharing his life lessons with him. Jimmy once told Frank, the number 2 guy next to a leader doesn't have to be the most capable. Sometimes it's safer to pick someone everyone likes, but who doesn't threaten you, because that kind of persona's easier to manage. But Jimmy never expected that the man he himself had chosen would end up being his biggest mistake. Later, Jimmy promoted Frank to run a local union chapter. It wasn't just a title bump. It meant Frank had officially entered the inner circle. For Frank, everything he had came from Jimmy. So he worked even harder, solving problems for Jimmy left and right. To shake the investigation, Jimmy tried using his connections to influence the case. He bribed jurors, trying to tilt the verdict in his favor. He thought he had everything under control until President Kennedy was assassinated. His brother stepped down as Attorney General. And some of the moves Jimmy had made started coming to light. In the end, he was convicted of jury tampering and sent to prison, even behind bars. Jimmy never fully lost his grip on the union, but his former deputy Fitz, who Jimmy had once promoted, started cozying up to the mob. Weak-willed Fitz did whatever the mob told him, and little by little, the mob took control of the union's most valuable assets, including that multi-billion-dollar pension fund. By then, Frank looked like a union leader on paper. But in reality, he was still handling Russell's dirty work. All Russell had to do was drop a hint, and Frank knew exactly what to do, because he never forgot who got him to where he was today. 4 years later, Jimmy got out of prison. He wanted to take back what was his control of the union, and get those mob-controlled funds back too. That decision didn't sit well with the powers that be. Jimmy coming back would cut into their bottom line. They wanted him to accept reality and retire quietly. But Jimmy wouldn't budge. He had run the union for too long to just walk away. As the tension kept building, the conflict turned uglier by the day. During the day, the mob blew up one of Jimmy's boats. At night, Jimmy's people wrecked a mob vehicle. The whole city was on edge. Caught in the middle, Frank became the bridge between both sides. He kept trying to get them to back down, because to him, both Jimmy and Russell meant everything. He didn't want to see either side destroy the other. Then came word that the union was throwing a dinner in Frank's honor. Frank wanted Jimmy to present him the award, because in his mind, without Jimmy, he wouldn't be where he was. But Frank also knew that wasn't an easy ask. A lot of the guests at that dinner were on the opposite side from Jimmy, and Jimmy had never wanted anything to do with those people. Still, after all those years together, Jimmy had come to see Frank as family. Even Frank's own daughter looked up to Jimmy more than she did her own father. So in the end, Jimmy showed up. Frank received his honor from Jimmy's hands. In that moment, he was finally recognized by the man he had always looked up to. But the tension between the mob and Jimmy never went away, because Jimmy held the pension funds, and the mob couldn't touch that money. They were running out of patience with his decisions. Russell tried one more time to mediate, but by then, Jimmy wasn't willing to compromise on anything. He believed he knew too many secrets for anyone to actually touch him. A few days later, Russell gave Frank a ring. There were only 3 of these rings in the world. One belonged to Russell himself. One belonged to the head of the mafia. And the third, he gave to Frank. That ring wasn't about power. It was about protection. Russell was sending a message to everyone. Frank was his man. No one was allowed to hurt him. But Russell also warned Frank that the Jimmy situation was beyond his control now. Jimmy had stepped on too many toes. This wasn't just a conflict anymore. It was a reckoning that couldn't be avoided. Frank understood what Russell was telling him. So he went to Jimmy and urged him to back off. He didn't spell it out directly, but he hinted that Jimmy needed to let it go. Jimmy still refused. He believed in his own influence, and in the secrets he held that would keep him safe. A few days later, Russell invited Frank to a wedding. Every time they stopped along the way, Frank would call Jimmy, begging him to sit down and negotiate. Finally, after Frank's constant pushing, Jimmy agreed to talk. To make sure Jimmy would be safe, Frank insisted on being there in person. They agreed to meet the next day at 2 p.m. in the city where Frank was staying. But that night, Russell told Frank the plan had changed. They would be staying an extra day. That whole night, Frank kept staring at the phone by his bed. He knew that if he called to warn Jimmy, it would be a betrayal of Russell. But if he did nothing, it meant Jimmy was walking into a death trap. What he didn't realize was that the phone call no longer mattered, because the so-called peace talk had been a setup from the very beginning. The mob had already decided to take Jimmy out, and the one they chose to carry it out was Frank. If Frank refused, his family would be targets too. Russell put Frank on a plane to the agreed city. When he landed, a car was already waiting for him. Inside was a new address and a gun already prepped for him. Along the way, Frank spotted Jimmy. He was waiting at the original meeting spot, believing a negotiation was about to happen. In that moment, Frank still had a chance to tell Jimmy the truth. But he chose to go to the room Russell had arranged instead. Inside, Russell's men were laying down carpet to keep any blood from staining the floor. To make sure everything went smoothly, Russell even had Jimmy's own son brought in. When Jimmy saw his son, he was confused. But when he saw Frank, every bit of caution disappeared. Because in his mind, Frank was one of the most trustworthy people he knew. When they walked into that room, Jimmy found it completely empty. And in that moment, he finally knew something was wrong. But it was already too late. The friend he had trusted most had just become the one to send him off for good. Soon after, the news broke that Jimmy had been shot. Frank sat there staring silently at the screen. His oldest daughter knew something wasn't right. She could tell her father was connected to it. As a former friend to Jimmy, Frank still made the first call to Jimmy's wife. He offered his condolences, but that phone call became a weight he could never shake. After that, everyone tied to Jimmy came under investigation. Frank, Russell, and everyone else. All ended up in prison on various charges, but not a single person was ever tried for Jimmy's murder. A few years later, Russell had a stroke and ended up in a wheelchair. That once feared crime boss had become a frail, broken old man. He couldn't even chew his favorite foods anymore. As time went on, everyone from that era faded away, one by one. Only Frank lived long enough to walk out of prison. But a long life never brought him happiness. His wife had died of illness long ago, and his daughters wanted nothing to do with him. They couldn't accept what their father had done, while he still could. Frank picked out a coffin for himself. Then he bought a burial plot. He started getting ready for the end. But the Jimmy case was never fully closed. Investigators came to see Frank again. They wanted him to finally tell the truth. Hardly anyone from that era was still alive. Frank was the last one who knew anything, but he still refused to talk. On Christmas Eve, Frank moved into a nursing home. He brought only a few old photos with him, pictures of his wife, his daughters, and the two most important men in his life, Russell and Jimmy. These men who once shook the world were now completely forgotten. Their era had ended without a sound. In his younger days, Frank slept with a gun by his bedside. He always locked his door tight and stayed alert at all times. Now, he often asked people to leave his door slightly open. He liked that crack of light. He'd sit there and look out through that gap, maybe hoping his family would come visit, maybe just remembering his old friends. He would ask people the same question over and over. What kind of person makes a call like that? That phone call was the one thing he could never let go of. But even at the very end of his life, he never found the answer. Looking back at Frank's life, he had once had so much power, money, status. He had even stepped into circles most people could never reach. But all those crowns faded away with time. Back when he was young, Frank convinced himself that everything he did was to protect his family, to give his wife and daughters a better life. He chose a dangerous path. But what he never saw was that his so-called protection was slowly pushing his family further and further away. The Irishman isn't just a mob movie. At its core, it's the story of one man's life. How a person, through the choices he makes, walks down a road with no turning back. And how, years later, he has to sit alone with all those decisions he made. What Frank chased in his youth was success as defined by everyone else. But in the end, he finally understood what really mattered. Not power, not status. It was the family he had neglected and the moments he could never get back. Some choices might look like glory when you're young, but at the end of the road, all that might be left is regret. That's the cruelest part of The Irishman. It doesn't give you a legendary hero. It shows you an ordinary man and how his own decisions slowly reshaped him. It's not just a mob film. It's a story about human nature, the weight of our choices, and the regrets we carry.